The topic of my keynote is Change Laboratories for Expansive Learning in Troubled Times. And I will present an approach to educational research which is based on the traditional cultural historical activity theory stemming from the work of Vygotsky, Leontev, Davidov and others, and further developed today in Finland and many other places of the world. The particular emphasis of this talk is on interventions and intervention methodology, particularly the change laboratory method, which has been developed in our research center and nowadays used around the world. And I will explore its potentials for educational research and educational change. In today's educational research, we have an increasing demand and quest for relevance and practical impact. It's quite obvious that much educational research remains relatively remote and distant from actual changes in educational practice, and particularly not necessarily sensitive to the challenges that in today's world we're facing. In my opinion, this is largely due to the dominance of the so-called gold standard in research, which emphasizes randomized controlled trials as the privileged way of conducting research, and leads typically to top-down policy recommendations and managerial orders, which do not necessarily connect very well with the everyday lived experience of educators and those who are educated. So there is an increasing dissatisfaction with this approach, and we see very important alternatives emerging. Particularly important, in my opinion, are initiatives of building relevance and impact for educational research from bottom up by creating coalitions and partnerships between researchers, the practitioners of educational institutions, and communities which are served. This type of collaborative formations, partnerships and coalitions are the breeding ground for new types of educational research, which definitely goes beyond the traditional confines of the academia. And particularly this new alternatives, they focus on interventions. We can talk about the rise of intervention research. A few years ago, both the Journal of the Learning Sciences and the Journal Cognition and Instruction published special issues on intervention research. And I think that this is becoming more and more important, and also, I think, endorsed by many people who are in the mainstream of educational research. Of course, there is a tradition of design-based research or design experiments, as Anne Brown used to call them in her path-breaking paper in 1992. Design-based research is still, I think, halfway between the traditional and the new. The design-based research typically suffers from the, let's say, monopoly over the design in the hands of researchers. In other words, those who actually conduct educational practice and those who are the learners are not designers. The designers are only the researchers typically. And this is shifting at the moment. In fact, I have contrasted what I call linear interventions and formative interventions as two very different notions of intervention. The linear interventions start from the idea that the interventionist, the researcher, knows the end result. And furthermore, the process is based on the idea that those who are actually then doing the educational work or the learning should follow the design, and if there are difficulties or resistance among them, this means that it's something that has to be fixed and corrected. In other words, it is a linear notion that starting from the design made by the interventionist researcher, then those who execute it should do it as smoothly as possible, and this should lead to a standardizable solution, which can be then duplicated and spread as if a ready-made package. And in the end, the aim is that the researchers control all the variables. So it has still a lot of the same idea of control that is traditional in for instance, in the randomized controlled trials. What I call formative interventions are different. Formative interventions are done together with the practitioners and learners. And Change Laboratory is a prime example of formative interventions. Jim Greeno commented on the idea of formative interventions by pointing out that the method of formative interventions can increase generative capabilities in groups of practitioners because formative interventions based on activity theory can and must generate a new type of dialogue and complementarity between practical impact and rigorous analysis. Analysis leading to understanding of this dialogue and complementarity and the development of generative capabilities that result would indeed provide a significant advance in the field's understanding of learning and development. I think this is a very sober assessment from a leading educational researcher who is not himself coming from the world of formative interventions, but is looking at this development and assessing it. Formative interventions, typically Change Laboratories, they start from the situation where the actual practitioners face a contradictory situation, something that is vital for their own work and lives, which they analyze and then transform, create a novel concept which is not known ahead of time to the researcher interventionists. In other words, the formative intervention generates something which was not there at the beginning. And the contents and the course of the intervention are subject to negotiation all through the process. The shape of the intervention, therefore, is eventually up to the participants. And the particularly important mechanism called double stimulation is at work. And I will return to this a little later to explain it, meaning that the participants gain agency and take charge of the process step by step. The aim of formative interventions is to generate new concepts that may be used in other settings as frames for the design of locally appropriate new solutions. In other words, it's not the standardizable package that is the result. that the result is a generative concept. And, of course, associated with that is transformative agency among the participants, because they are the ones who own the concept and put it into practice. And finally, the role of the researcher is not to try to control all the variables, but to provoke and sustain this expansive transformation process, which is actually led and owned by the practitioners. So these are two very different notions of intervention. I'm not saying that linear interventions are useless. To the contrary, they are the dominant form. You know, most interventions start from the idea that we have to reach a specific result, whereas formative interventions start from the situation we have to solve a pressing, problematic, contradictory situation. We have to find a new way out. And nobody knows yet what exactly is the way. The change laboratory, as I said, is a prime example of formative interventions. The first change laboratory was held here in Finland in 1995, so it has quite a history already, 25 years, and quite widespread application around the world. So in a change laboratory, the starting point is that an activity system, let's say a school or a community or multiple interacting activity systems, they face a challenging problem, and typically researchers are invited or become partners with these people. Fieldwork is conducted to capture how this pressing problem manifests itself in the everyday lives and everyday work of the participants. In other words, the researchers collect what is called mirror data on the problem. Often this is done by videotaping critical situations, critical interactions, interviewing, doing shadowing, following the practitioners in their everyday work. Then when the actual intervention begins, these actors come together in 6 to 12 change laboratory sessions, which typically last about 2 hours each. Mirror data excerpts are presented to the participants. In other words, they look at their own problem situations as if in a mirror, typically with the help of video. And this triggers a conflict of motives and an effort to resolve this conflict, to get a way out of the problem. The participants analyze the historical development and present contradictions in their activity system, trying to identify root causes of the trouble. They also project a future zone of proximal development for their activity and design a new model for the activity. And they implement the new model in practice, typically first testing it in limited spearhead projects and gradually moving to a full-scale implementation. The whole process is shaped so as to generate an expansive learning cycle. And I will come to this concept of expansive learning very briefly, which has embedded in it, there are loops of double stimulation. These two concepts, expansive learning cycle and double stimulation, are critical for the understanding of the theoretical background and idea of change laboratories. All the sessions of the change laboratory videotaped for detailed analysis. various methods of analyzing these processes have been developed and used by a good number of researchers in publications. The change laboratories by now they have been conducted and analyzed in over 30 countries. There is a very large literature, and I am not trying to summarize it. I will just give a few examples. But here are early examples from change laboratories from different settings. The first one was conducted in the Finnish Postal Services in 1995. There was a change laboratory in a middle school in Helsinki, 1998, in a hospital, in a bank, and so on. Today, I would say that perhaps the most common variations of the change laboratory are those which are conducted in educational settings, schools, universities, other educational settings, but also, for instance, in healthcare and other domains. The layout of the change laboratory can be simplified with the help of this picture. Basically, the semicircle there is practitioners, the participants, and the researcher interventionists, and they face three surfaces of representation. On the right-hand side, you see the mirror in which we display problematic situations from the everyday activity, typically videotaped, also interviews, statistics, and other evidence of how the problem is actually occurring. On the left-hand side is what we call model or vision. And here the idea is that the problems are analyzed systematically with the help of theoretical tools, conceptual models, such as the model of an activity system, to which I will return briefly. But you see already here on the left-hand side on this model vision surface the basic template for the analysis of an activity system, which consists of the basic components of the subject-object mediating tools or artifacts, community rules, and divisional labor. In the middle, the center surface here is basically empty. When you move between the very concrete examples of trouble on the mirror to trying to make sense of them with the help of theoretical concepts, and you move between these two, what happens is in the middle you start getting ideas, you start developing some specific helpful ideas and tools to understand and reshape the situation. So the middle surface is for ideas and tools. And in a change laboratory, we typically move between the present, the past, and the future. These surfaces are actively filled and used all through the change laboratory. And all the sessions are videotaped. So it can look very simply like this. Here are the three surfaces. This is a change laboratory session in a healthcare setting, and there is a scribe who is actively filling those surfaces according to the events and instructions coming from the participants. Now, to the very key concept of expansive learning. Expansive learning is a theory of learning that basically sees learning as a transformation of activity in the face of the unknown. In other words, expansive learning is learning what is not yet there. It's a learning process in which the result or the end result is not predetermined. There is not a wise instructor who knows the final outcome. We know that this kind of learning processes are quite common, especially in times of crisis or big transformations. But they are seldom theorized and understood. Much of my own work has been focused on trying to make sense and create a theory of these types of learning. And this basic model of a cycle contains the idea that expansive learning is not a quick process. It's quite a lengthy and demanding process which begins with questioning the current situation, leads to an analysis in which typically the contradictions, the tensions become quite vividly experienced. And then to attempts at modeling a new solution. And when a new model is created, it is examined and tested and gradually implemented, which allows the participants to reflect on the process and to start consolidating and generalizing the new practice. Now, this is, of course, it looks awfully smooth. In reality, it never is. It typically is full of let's say, backlashes, various kinds of obstacles, mini cycles that loop back and you have to return. Sometimes also the whole cycle breaks down and is stopped. So it's never smooth. But for the sake of making the idea clear, it has to be presented in a, let's say, cleaned up version. The important issue here is that it is expansive, the process is expansive at least in two different senses. First of all, it leads to an expanding participation. The arrows that you see here, they are becoming gradually wider as we move on in the process, indicating that often the questioning is started by just a few individuals, let's say in an activity system or a workplace or a community. And gradually the process then involves more people and becomes more robust socially and collaboratively. So there is this expansion in terms of participation, what we might call social expansion. But then there is, of course, also the expansion of the understanding of what is what we are doing. What is it? What is the object that we're working on? For instance, how do we understand our learners? How do we understand learning and our learners as the target, the object that we are working on? And this often requires a radical expansion in terms of, for instance, time, temporal understanding. That the learner is not anymore seen as only behaving in one lesson, but in a much more longitudinal way. So it's both a social spatial expansion and temporal expansion that we're talking about. Now, the other key concept was double stimulation, as I mentioned. Now, double stimulation comes directly from the work of Vygotsky. And Vygotsky gives a very nice little example of it. Think about you have a conflict of motives. Let's say you want to wake up early in the morning, but you also want to sleep. How do you solve this conflict? Well, you use an artifact, for instance, an alarm clock. And you put it at 6 o'clock in the morning. Oftentimes, the very fact that you do this, that you make this decision, is actually enough. You wake up 5 minutes before the alarm actually rings. You have already, in a way, programmed yourself to take this action, to break this conflict of motives and move on. And that's how humans are capable of going beyond paralyzing conflicts of motives. We use artifacts to enhance our will, enhance our transformative agency so that we can transform the situation into something in which we can actually move on. Vygotsky used also the traditional story of Buridan's donkey, who is at the crossroads, and on the left there is food, on the right hand side there is drink, and he doesn't know which way to go and finally dies because he's paralyzed between these two equally attractive alternatives. And Vygotsky points out that the human being doesn't have to do this. A human being would take a coin and say, heads I go left, tails I go right. In other words, you have always this artifactual cultural resource which can enhance your decision making and take this sort of decisive action to break out of the conflict. Now, this is very critical for the expansive learning, because expansive learning is continuously facing these conflictual situations in your everyday reality and finding solutions to them. And you have to find ways to move on. And that's why, these conflicts of motives are very important in expansive learning, and it's also very important to find what we call second stimuli, various artifacts that enable you to move on and to find solutions. Often they are very simple things. They may be just some mapping of the situation on a piece of paper, or a very simple slogan, set of keywords, anything like that, that will then enable moving out of the paralysis and toward actual expansive actions. And this loop of double stimulation, this comes from the work of Annalisa Sannino, who has developed a very careful reconstruction and reanalysis of Vygotsky's idea of double stimulation, and also developed the model on the basis of experimental work. Now, this kind of a loop in which you first have to face the conflict of motives, uptake a second stimulus, turn it into an auxiliary motive that allows you to move forward, and then use it in the actual critical situation, and implement it, and then this kind of loops will have to be repeated. I think a good example of this could be also a very simple example. Think about that you like chocolate, but at the same time you know that you need to reduce your weight. You need to stop eating a lot of chocolate. Now, this kind of a conflict of motives can be very nasty, as many people know. One simple way to find a second stimulus for this is to decide that for each day I prepackage one nicely packaged piece of chocolate for myself, which I can take as a dessert after a meal. But it's prepackaged in such a way that I know that, okay, this I can take. And it kind of serves you as a way to move forward. And it can be repeated, and gradually it will lead to a self-constructed habit that allows you to control your intake of sweets. Now, these smaller loops of double stimulation need to be built into the different phases of the expansive learning cycle, which is schematically depicted in this picture. Obviously, this is a rather complex model, and in the end, a change laboratory is something that has to be quite carefully planned together between the researcher interventionists and the participating practitioners. Now, I would like to give a few examples of change laboratories as they have been conducted in educational settings. And I have selected 3 examples. One is a very early one from my own work, a change laboratory conducted in a Jakomäki Middle School in Helsinki here in Finland. Already the analysis of this was published already in 2002. The second example is from Botswana, Africa. The Molefe Senior Secondary School in Botswana. A paper on this was published in 2012. And the third one is the Martin Luther King High School in Madison, Wisconsin. Aidin Ball and his research group published on this in 2018. Now, I will briefly tell about each one of these 3. In the Jakomäki Middle School, the issue was that this was a school heavily populated by immigrant kids, and the very area of that part of Helsinki has, or at least used to have, a lot of social problems and various kinds of, let's say, underprivileged families. The school was struggling with the alienation of the students. Many students felt that school is useless because they are anyway losers, and this led to a kind of cycles of failure among the students. Very common in underprivileged areas in urban schools around the world. Now, in the change laboratory, the teachers, this was conducted with all the teachers of the school, analyzed this mirror data that we had collected, which they also brought themselves into the change laboratory sessions. And they identified their contradiction as a dual contradiction. On one hand, they saw their students as being apathetic, not interested in anything, but also suddenly extremely energetic. You know, they saw their students as almost like 2 different people. In classroom situations of normal instruction, they were often very, very passive. But when they went out of the classroom, they might have been extremely energetic. And on the other hand, then there was in their own instruments, they emphasized a lot of the control, that you cannot trust the students because they will break everything, they will not do what you tell them to do, etc., etc. So you have to use various forms of control just to keep them in line. At the same time, obviously, there was also the notion that you need to trust them. These tensions, when the teachers identified them in their own talk, in their own practices, and they saw that the outcome was widespread alienation and failure, they developed some new solutions, and most important was what they called the final project. In this school, when the students graduated from the ninth grade, they used to leave the school with only a report card with grades and often not particularly impressive grades. The teachers started to feel that the students should leave with something more, something tangible for which they could be proud. And the idea was to create the final project in the ninth grade, which would last roughly half of the year, a cross-subject project on any relevant topic chosen by the student. And they set aside a number of school hours exclusively to work on the final project. And each student had a teacher assigned to guide and help with the final project. And also, very importantly, if the student so wished, he or she could ask that his or her final project should be evaluated as a grounds for raising the final grade in a given school subject. Let's say, for instance, you did your final project on Michael Jackson's music, and you wrote it in English. And you could suggest that this work should be assessed as an argument to raise my final grade in English. And the outcomes of the final project were displayed in an exhibition at the end of the school year. This turned out to be a very powerful way for the teachers to kind of start seeing the student in a different light, and the students themselves to gain a different kind of self-confidence, including the immigrant students, because their own particular strengths could now be actually brought out, which often were completely silenced in the normal school going. And the effects were quite impressive in terms also that many students were able to use this to improve their final grades. So this was the first example. The second example, the Molefe Senior Secondary School in Botswana. Here, a research group consisting of both local researchers and colleagues from our Cradle Research Center was asked to help the school to cope with the challenges of digitalization. However, it very soon in the change laboratory process, already in preparing it for it, it became clear that digitalization as such was not the sort of starting point. The starting point was that there was something going on that made the students very uneasy and created a lot of tensions. The school was operating on the idea that the students must be categorized into high performance, middle performance, and low performance, especially in sciences. And especially a category which was called single science students, which meant that they are the lowest performance in sciences, became a kind of dumping category in which if a student ended up categorized as a single science student, you would know that you would get pretty weak instruction. Teachers would not expect that you can succeed in your studies, etc. So there was a very powerful mechanism of categorization and negative, let's say, stigma stamped on a large group of students. And so in the change laboratory, the teachers actually focused on trying to do something about this. And the most important solution, the model that they created, was what they call dialogical study planning. And the authors of this project write, the idea consisted of creating small student groups in which the students would support each other in analyzing their situation and preparing a study plan with the help of pre-planned tools. The idea was that the students would help each other in turn in analyzing their situation and planning their studies. Two of the teachers who had been in the small group that planned the first proposal for this new tool took the idea and prepared a list of discussion themes for the small student groups to carry out the dialogical study planning process. It turned out to be, even though as such it looks like a relatively small change and a relatively small new model, it turned out to be very important because it kind of broke the existing conflict of motives that was sort of solidified in the treatment of the single science students, and showed that many of the single science students, when they had the chance to actually plan together with their peers their studies, would actually turn out to be much more competent and have much more potential than had been initially expected. And this changed also the teachers' way of thinking about their students and challenged the very idea of categorization. Now the third example is very recent. This is from Aidan Ball and his research group in Wisconsin. Here the challenge has been the racialization of school discipline. In many American schools, and typically in Madison, Wisconsin, in the schools, black kids, children of color, receive disproportionately many punishments or various kinds of sanctions for their behavior. In other words, they become the troublemakers, and they receive a lot of disciplinary measures, absolutely disproportionately, if you look at the percentage of these kids and others. And of course, this is connected to the much wider problem in the United States, which we know very well now that we have seen the Black Lives Matter movement, namely that the whole North American system of law enforcement is biased in a similar way. In other words, if you are a person of color, you're much more likely to be stopped by the police. You're much more likely to end up in prison than if you have a white skin. This racial disproportionality and sort of deeply built-in racism in the system, systemic structural racism, was the target of the change laboratories that Aidan Ball conducted. And here you see, I'm not going to go into the details of this model, but you see that there are three activity systems instead of one. The activity system of the teachers, the activity system of the students, and the activity system of the parents. All these three participated in the change laboratory, and they redesigned the system of discipline in the school. And they created a model which they call culturally responsive behavior support system. The very idea is that instead of sort of rushing to disciplinary method, disciplinary procedures and punishments, there is a much more sensitive and supportive approach that helps both the students and the teachers to in a way stop and think and help the student when there is a disturbance. I'm not going to go into the details of this model, but it's very important to point out that in this change laboratory there were teachers and also many parents of color. And often the initial discussions were very tense because these parents were very fed up with the way their kids have been treated in the school. And they found common ground and were able to design a new system for school discipline, this culturally responsive behavior support system, which is now being practiced, it's in place and spreading in other schools in Wisconsin, in Madison. So this was the third example, and now what we see first of all is that at the moment there's more and more this kind of urgency and critical contradictions that are faced also in educational institutions. This third example of Aidan Ball's study in Wisconsin is a good example of that the school situation is connected to a much broader turmoil in the society. In this case, the sort of structural racism. Educational institutions are increasingly involved. They cannot be any more separated or encapsulated from these larger societal issues. And I would claim that specifically in education, in schools, we are going to face more and more at least two very major contradictions which are specific to education but connected to the broader societal development. The first one is the issue of knowledge. Commoditization of knowledge, packaging knowledge more and more, turning it into something that is continuously tested, graded, measured. In other words, becomes a commodity, a marketable packages, versus development of knowledge as common good, as something that everybody can contribute to, which is not proprietary and sold on the market, but much more something like a foundational resource and a human right. This is, of course, aggravated very much by the fact that our current digital technologies allow both very effective commoditization, prepackaging of knowledge, and continuous testing, high-stakes testing, etc. But the same technologies also allow that everybody can contribute and create knowledge and disseminate and spread it with very low cost. In other words, we have both this idea of open knowledge, knowledge for as commons, and the extremely heavy pressure toward commoditization and privatization of knowledge. These tensions will only grow. They are not going to be easily resolved. In this sense, the development of education and schools is tightly connected to the issues of what happens to the internet, what happens to these digital technology giants and their practical monopoly over knowledge today. These interconnections must be faced also by educators. If we hide our heads in the bush, it's only going to be worse. A second contradiction that I would like to emphasize has to do with students' motivation, or as we call it, engagement. much of the research on student engagement today kind of assumes that the student is a sort of self-serving individualist who looks for personal gain. And this is, of course, connected to the commoditization. The idea that, by picking points, being smart, you gain maximum gain from education. Versus the idea that student engagement would be built as involvement in collective efforts toward equity and sustainability of our planet. We have the example of Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who shows that it's possible that young students are really driven not by personal gain, but by a concern and serious responsibility for our collective future. And this tension will also only grow. It is not going to go away. And so I think that it's time that as educators we kind of ask the question that George Counts asked in 1932 in his well-known book, Dare the School Build a New Social Order? In other words, the school cannot anymore wait that somebody else solves the problems. And this means that also these interventions, this kind of interventionist research that I have tried to exemplify with the help of these change laboratories, has to take increasingly a sort of a, let's say, an expanded perspective, meaning that to meet these challenges, formative interventions will become more and more distributed across sectors and across levels of societal power and decision making. I have here a couple of examples. In Sweden, a colleague called Maria Spante is conducting change laboratories in all the schools of a municipality to overcome the built-in mechanisms of school failure among boys there. And she has also got the local political decision makers involved in one of the change laboratories, which is clearly, moving toward a more inclusive and more, let's say, distributed forms of intervention. Another example, in Chile, a colleague called Ivan Valenzuela is conducting change laboratories in the disadvantaged schools of the whole region, and aimed at building coalitions among the schools and other societal actors to lift up the quality of education in these very vulnerable communities, which have been disadvantaged for decades. This means that it's not just a single school, not just a single community, but the whole network of schools and communities and actors who take this as a challenge. And the last example, I have just recently started a new project here in Finland with 8th grade students who in change laboratories will design their own activities and projects so that they find them sources of significance and support to their own future. These projects, which are generated by these school students, these adolescents themselves, will cut across and connect the different worlds of these adolescents, school, peers, social media, civic engagement, family. The idea is that, again, it's not just one activity system or just one sphere of life, but they have to interconnect and generate coalitions that can actually influence significant societal challenges. So this is how I see the near future of educational research, increasingly taking responsibility and getting involved, building coalitions for formative interventions. Thank you.